His body had been skinned. "James?" Jen whispered, her voice hollow, the beginnings of tears forming at the edges of her eyes. The human form was all blood and muscle, curled in a ball, fetal like in death. The earth had soaked in most of its blood, its hunger unforgiving. To our grief, it would reabsorb James into itself. All he was to the earth was organic matter to be composed. I put my arm around Jen's shoulders and turned her away. She wept into me as we walked back to camp. I reassured her, telling her we couldn't tell if it really was him. But out there, there's nobody else it could have been. We were the only humans for miles, outnumbered by animals and insects, things better suited to this place than us. We were the outsiders here. I saw a glow through the trees. We were nearly there. I heard faint voices from the glow. Did you hear that? It sounded like twigs snapping. It was so cliched. Lori was repeating what she had heard in countless horror films. But there were no monsters here, just Jen and myself. Jen had stopped weeping by now. We walked in silence to the camp. I almost wished we could just keep walking right past it. I didn't want to have to explain what we had seen. Alas, we walked into the light of the fire. Lori snapped her head up at us, eyes widened in fear, before realizing it was just us. Brian saw us, noticed James was absent. You didn't find him? Maybe he got lost. Did you look by the stream? He then noticed Jen's tear-stained face. What happened? Jen, Kyle, where's James? Lori was beginning to walk towards us. Hesitantly, a rabbit inches up from the trap. Tears had begun to fall silently from Jen's eyes again. He's gone, I said. Brian looked me in the eyes, searching for meaning. He hoped what wasn't there. Oh God. Lori brought her hand to her mouth. She joined us in despair, loudly weeping into the darkness, beyond the flame's glow. We stood, grotesque weeping statues illuminated by fire in a dark forest. They were only now realizing they had no place in. No one moved, no one made a sound. Infinity came and went before anybody spoke. Help, James shouted from beyond the firelight. The air congealed. I felt a rush of heat through my body, hair on end, bile rising in my throat. The voice of my dead friend called to me. James, Lori screamed and ran towards the voice. We all followed her through the forest. Lori, slow down, Brian called to deaf ears. Eventually we stopped. Lori was gone. Shit, I said, turning to Jen. My confusion was reflected in her face. She had seen the corpse the same as I did. Could it have been an animal? It was hard to tell in the moonlight, but I was so sure it was human. Was there another group out there? Perhaps it was a lone hiker? Discovering exactly who it was becoming less and less important to us as I realized we were standing in the middle of a dark forest and I had no idea what had skinned whoever that was. We need to get back to camp, I told Brian and Jen. But Lori's still out here, Brian exclaimed. We can't leave her. Lori will probably find James and he'll come back to camp. They'll probably be there when we get back. I didn't believe a word I was saying. Looking at Jen, neither did she. We both knew we were abandoning Lori, but the shock was wearing off, and we were both quickly realizing the implications of what we had seen. Animals don't skin their prey and leave it there. There was something else that didn't belong out here. Yeah, we should get back to the fire, Jen added. She wanted to get back as much as I did. At least in the light you could see what was around you. Here it was almost pitch black. Bryant reluctantly agreed, and we walked back in silence. As we got closer, I noticed something. We should be able to see the fire from here. We began to walk faster. We reached our sight, and the extinguished remains of our fire. What the fuck? I looked up to see Brian and Jen's pale faces behind the trees were illuminated by moonlight. I saw a pale face between the trees. It quickly receded into the darkness. Lori, Jen, and Brian followed my gaze and glanced behind them, seeing nothing but forest. Did you see her? Jen asked. I don't know. I guess I didn't. I continued to stare into the forest, wondering if the pale moonlight was all I saw, or if it really was her. Guys, the fire shouldn't have gone out that fast. It should have lasted at least a few more hours, Brian said, kneeling by the fire. I'll get it going again. Oh God, Lori's voice rang through our camp. Brian stood and made to walk towards it. Stop, I motioned towards him. He looked at me, confused. Listen. Oh God, Lori's voice called out again. It sounded wrong, exactly the same as it did seconds before and earlier that night. James, again the word she had called out earlier. What the fuck? Brian had stopped trying to follow the voice. I suddenly felt the cold in the moonlight. Exposed in the clearing, I wanted to bury myself underneath the earth and hide. I felt a fear like I haven't felt in a long time, a fear of the unknown, of the dense darkness all around me, of the voices and pale faces in the trees. Wind rustled the trees around us, and I suddenly noticed the smell of copper. Do you guys smell that? I was interrupted by a large dark shape flying towards us, and I ducked as it flew over my head, crashing into the tree behind me. Brian and Jen spun around to see what it was. I looked in the direction it came from and saw something moving between the trees, and from what I could see, it was tall with long, thin limbs. Holy shit, I turned. That's what Brian was referring to. It was a deer. It looked like it had been ripped in half. Who the fuck could do that? Help! Oh god! My skin was crawling. The voices of James and Lori were echoing through the clearing, their mimicked voices from whatever was tormenting us. I could see the looks of fear in Brian and Jen's face. We need to get away from here, I said to them. They both nodded. We grabbed our packs and turned our torches as we began the long, hours-long hike out of the forest. We could still hear voices as we walked. It was following us. The thing with walking through a forest at night is it all looks all the same. You could have walked 100 miles and wouldn't know. It begins to feel like you're walking through limbo. We were silent as we walked, listening out for anything that could let us know it was close. The light of our torches darted through the trees whenever we heard the voices. We turned a corner and in front of us stood James. His flesh was pulled tight over his face. His arms and legs were stretched out, long and angular and thin. Black eyes stared at us. We stared back. He was completely still. He opened his mouth and suddenly, "Help!" he barked, guttural and aggressive. Then he got down on all fours and began running at us. He moved like some demonic spider. Every movement was a sudden twitch. We turned and ran screaming as it growled and chased us through the forest. At once low and growling and high-pitched whining, like a dying animal. The smell of copper returned, stronger than before, and I realized it was blood. "Get to the stream," I shouted to Brian and Jen. I couldn't tell if they heard. I barely heard myself. Blood was pumping against my eardrums. I could see through the moonlight glinting off the surface of the water. It was just a few meters away. I didn't even know that the thing could swim, but at least it would be pitch black around the stream. I ran to the edge of the water and turned around. They weren't out yet. I stared into the trees. It was almost completely silent. I realized I may be alone with whatever that thing is. Then Jen burst out of this tree line, gasping for air as she turned to face the tree line, walking backwards towards the water. "Jen," I shouted, running over to her, relieved to see someone else. "Did you see Brian?" She ran over to me, shaking her head. We stood together and waited with our backs to the water, watching the tree line. Eventually Brian also ran out. We called him over and joined us watching the tree line. "I think it's gone," I said. Neither of them said anything. I turned to them and saw they were both looking across the stream, eyes wide with fear. I turned and saw Lori and James standing on the opposite bank of the stream. They were both disfigured, stretched out and deformed, their skin fitting poorly on the frames of the creatures beneath them. I realized as we watched them that they were watching us, observing us. Their bodies began to change. The smell of copper grew as the shapes of the bodies normalized. Their skin beginning to fit better. The eyes changed from black to white. Slowly, irises spread from the center. The creatures changed before our horrified eyes until they were looking like perfect copies of Lori and James. The Lori creature opened its mouth. "Get to the stream," my own voice left its mouth. A shiver racked my body. I started stepping back. The creature repeated the phrase over and over again, changing like the pitch and tone until exactly like Lori. They were learning how to imitate us. "Guys, we have to go," I whispered, stepping back. Brian and Jen were frozen in horror. I pulled them from behind as they began walking, unable to tear their eyes away from the abomination before them. The James creature opened its mouth and soaked what I had just whispered. By now I was drenched in sweat, despite the cold night. I was witnessing were the things of nightmares, the things that drive a man insane, the things that break you inside. I turned and ran. I had stopped caring about anything, myself, my friends. All I wanted to do was get as far away from those things as possible. I hear running behind me. I don't know whose footsteps they are. They could be my friends or those creatures. Either way, I'm not going to stop running. I hear the voices of Lori, James, Jen, and Brian. They're everywhere. I don't know whose voices are real and whose are the things. I don't even know how many things there are in this forest. The thought keeps me running. It's all that keeps me running. My lungs and muscles burn. Sweat drips from my body. I am racked with exhaustion, but I can't stop. I won't let this forest be my grave. I can still hear the running and the voices, but I can't keep going. My body is refusing to continue. I fall to the ground weeping. I crawl to a tree and prop myself up against it, trying to stay silent. But my body betrays me. My lungs are on fire. They need oxygen. Again, my own willing, I begin to take huge breaths of air. I'm aware of how much sound I'm making, but I can't stop. Eventually my lungs stop burning, but the exhaustion hits bone deep. How long do I have? How long have I been running? It could have been hours. Now I'm alone in the forest, lost in the dark. Spots of pale moonlight barely give me enough light to see the trees around me. I am cold, my body refuses to move, but I am so tired. "Kyle?" My heart stops. It's Jen's voice. "Kyle, it's Jen, where are you?" I want to call out. I need someone. I don't want to be alone in this forest. "Kyle, I'm scared. I can't do this. Jen, I'm here." I hear footsteps in front of me, coming closer. I notice the sounds of the forest and the absence of it. You get used to sounds of the forest when you're in it long enough. And the animals, the insects, the crackling of trees. There was nothing. The animals and insects and trees lay silent, the way animals hide when there's a predator nearby. All I heard were footsteps. Jen stepped into the moonlight. How did you know where I was? She stared at me silently. Ryan stepped into the light beside her, Lori next, James next to her. A cloud covered the moon. The forest went dark.